What is up, plant people? Welcome back to the Planthropology Podcast, the show where we dive into the lives, careers, and general awesomeness of some very cool plant people to figure out why they do what they do and what keeps them coming back for more. I'm Vikram Baliga, your host and your humble guide in this journey through the plant sciences. And as always, y'all, I'm so excited to be with you today. So my guest today is a biologist, an evolutionary biologist, a curator of a herbarium here at Texas Tech University, and a moss enthusiast. Did you know that was a thing? I actually did kind of know it was a thing. And Dr. Matt Johnson is one of my very favorite moss enthusiasts. He teaches the biology of plants, other biology classes. He studies genetics and plant history and evolutionary biology and evolutionary history. And he is just genuinely one of the nicest people I know. Just a genuinely smart and delightful human being. So Matt and I both work at Texas Tech University together, and until recently we hadn't met. We were Twitter friends and all that, and one day I went over to check out the herbarium, and it was super cool, and he gave me a tour, and we talked about him being on the show. So I'm so excited that he got to come in and talk to me today, or for today's episode. We didn't talk today. That's not how this works. This is there's magic. There's things that happen behind the scenes. But yeah, that's all I got. Thanks for listening. You're going to love this episode. So get ready for episode 81 of Planthropology with my friend, Dr. Matt Johnson. This is one of the rare ones that I get to record in person these days. And I've got Matt Johnson in my office, who is the director of the E.L. Reed Herbarium at Texas Tech University and does all kinds of other cool things. Matt, how are you today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's exciting. We've kind of talked about this for a little bit, and I'm glad we get to connect finally. So, gosh, it seems like you do a lot of things.
Yeah. So my background is actually in evolutionary biology, starting at Duke in North Carolina. Did both my undergrad and my PhD there, and then kind of did a little zigzag around the country to Chicago, worked at the Chicago Botanic Garden on the moss tree of life and putting that together, and then started here in 2017, where I guess I kind of wear two hats. I've got one as a professor with a research lab on genetics and genomics and phylogeny, and then also as director of the herbarium, which has about 30,000 plants up on the roof of the biology building that nobody really knows about until we bring them up there.
Yeah, so I got to see it not too long ago, and I did not know it was there either. You know, I've been around tech for a while, and had been in this position for quite a while, and we kind of connected on Twitter, which is it's funny how that works because we're at the same university and we're maybe a half a mile from each other. I don't know. It feels longer when you're walking there, but. And it took a tweet about something or the other to get us connected one time. But
yeah, I noticed that you had the location on your tweets. So it was like Lubbock. I'm like, wait a minute, hang on, this guy is here. And yeah, I mean, because we're in different colleges, I'm in the arts and sciences, and you're in the ag school. But I am aware of plant and soil science department that you've got here. We have the class biology of plants. It's a non-majors class that I teach in a rotation, and plant and soil science majors are required to take it. So we get a number of them coming in, and it's really nice because it brings a balance to the often pre-med majors of biology.
Right.
There's people who's interested in research as well, but folks interested in plants are often coming from other departments at a big university like this.
Yeah, well, and I think that's an important point. I think that there is maybe I don't know. It's an interesting thing because it's a lot of universities. It's like, oh, you should know this person. I'm like, there are 40,000 people. Like, right. You can't meet everyone for sure. But so going back to your background a little bit, what got you interested in moss or plants or everything and anything in between?
Yeah, so I was pretty interested in science growing up. I was a little bit of the oddball in the family that's mostly English and literature. Both of my parents are teachers, but making really big interest into reading popular science books in high school. Really want to be a biology major. the pre-med thing for me lasted about 5 seconds. So two classes of organic chemistry, but right.
Yeah.
The transition to doing research really happened as an undergraduate, especially during the summer. National Science Foundation has this really great research experience for undergraduates program that I participated in. And then the following year, as a rising senior, I worked in a herbarium, and they gave me the opportunity to go out and do a field trip.
Okay.
And it was with a graduate student, another herbarium assistant, and a botanist who had just gotten his PhD. We traveled all around basically the whole coast of Atlantic coastal plain of North America, and collecting peat moss. And it was during that field trip that it really hit me how to connect classes to what I was seeing out in nature. For example, you learn in class that species have to stay separate because they have to stay physically separate in order to remain different species. And you learn about that in class, and then you're out in nature and you see that there are 2 species of peat moss that are literally touching, but they're not. They're still separate species. They're not interbreeding. They're still staying pretty separate from each other.
Yeah. And
that is wild. And it was actually being out in nature, really connecting to those sort of classroom studies.
And that's super important, because I think it's funny because I think the answer that we give people in biology in general, or in the life sciences, is the answer to everything is it depends. Right. We have very few like hard and fast rules about anything, but then in practice, a lot of times we treat some of the things that we deal with like hard and fast rules. So I think that experience of maybe finding some of those interesting lines between them, and where those lines are a little bit blurred, is actually really important from a biological standpoint.
Yeah, I think being out in nature really helps with biology, especially, and that happens to me all the time, especially as I developed into more of the computational side of biology. Biology is becoming a very computational science. It's important to have these skills, but then it's not until I'm back out in nature, I'm like, oh yeah, why is this plant here? Why isn't it over there? How are these 2 species coexisting? That's what drives the questions, I think, is just this curiosity about the world.
For sure. Oh, 100%. So that kind of what you were talking about just now leads me to 2 things that I want to discuss. And I'm going to put you on the spot as a biologist. Are species a real thing?
Oh, no.
We're going to just dive into the controversy, 9 minutes into this podcast?
I've had some interesting reflections on this the last couple of years. I know that in classes, often it's taught that species are these reproductively isolated populations and blah, 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 textbook definition. Mm-hmm. Glosses over the fact that there's 1,000 species concepts that people have come up with.
Right.
And I think about, coming up with different, connectors for devices, and each one is different. Someone's like, oh, this is the new one that's going to replace all of them. And now there's just one more to.
And you got to keep that drawer full of, yeah.
Yeah. So a little while ago, I made the observation on Twitter that species concepts are like is a hot dog a sandwich of biology? And the debate that surrounds it can get quite philosophical and also quite dumb, and both dumb and philosophical at the same time. I had one discussion in a class that involved somebody quoting, something, the Greek urn, the poem John Keats' Ode to a Grecian Urn. Mm-hmm. Truth is beauty and beauty is truth. And so it gets real interesting. I think that species are hypotheses.
Huh.
And I think that a lot of times we get weighed down by the practicalities of defining a species, which could be scientific. Does it look different from another species? Is it mating with something from another species? And then a really practical thing is we have this law that's the Endangered Species Act.
Right.
And so we need to, in our laws, have some protection and conservation of that one taxonomic group. It's not the Endangered Variety Act, and it's not the Endangered Genus Act. Well, there's a practical implication for this, and that's what I point out when students roll their eyes at me when I ask them that same question.
Yeah.
Is that you really need to think about this from a variety of angles. So, as a hypothesis, let's test if they're different using computational models. Like the leaves of this species fundamentally different from the leaves of that species. Are they flowering at the same time? You got to look out in nature and do the test to figure out if they're separate or not. And then from my, especially my research in phylogenetics, looking for the common ancestors of species, that in some groups might be the last thing that happens when two species come from one species. And in other groups, it might be the first thing that happens. So it's really a matter of not applying a universal rule to everything, but that there are a couple of interesting patterns and putting them together in the order that apparently matters for that group of plants.
That's really a great answer. I mean, I you know, and it's something that I think it's funny because scientists like to fight about stuff. Like, I think it's something that we really, I don't know if we actually like it, but it's something we seem to be really good at, is to split hairs about things. And I think what you're talking about is a good example of that, because it's like we take this and we're going to debate it to death,
right,
and all these things, when ultimately so much of it is down to communicating with each other well,
right,
through these concepts,
right,
and communicating clearly.
Right.
Like, if I say a species to someone, like, at least I'm understood by what I'm saying.
And the audience is important too. You know, I mentioned the Endangered Species Act, but then if there are people who are stewards of a piece of land that might have one of those species, it matters differently whether that species is defined based on its DNA molecules and their history, which you can't do yet. Maybe soon, but not yet.
Sure.
Out in the field, if you're the parks manager trying to figure out if your piece of land needs to get some extra pot of money to help you protect the species, or you just really need to know whether the leaves are different so that you can figure out, like, I've got two species on this land or one species on this land. And so to that extent, they are real to us as units of things that we should protect. Maybe they are not super special in their taxonomic rank.
Sure.
But there are some cases where it seems pretty clear that keeping them from breeding with each other is an important aspect of keeping species separate. And then, of course, you just turn to the oaks and everything breaks down.
Yeah, oaks don't play by the rules. They just do whatever they want.
Yeah, they all hybridize with each other.
Yep. Yeah, and it's funny because you'll see an oak and you're like, what is this? I'm like, nobody, it's impossible to know. No. It's just whatever.
No, it's,
It is a red oak-ish. It is red oak adjacent.
Right.
No, that's really interesting because that is a common debate. And I know it's one that a lot of the listeners probably have heard in some context, whether on Twitter or in a class or something. And again, I think it's important that we be understood, but it's also important that we be accurate, in the things that we say. Mm-hmm. The other thing you talked about is while you were going in and collecting, you talked about peat moss.
Right.
Can you give us just a quick primer on peat moss? What is peat moss?
Sure. Well, peat moss is a moss, which is actually interesting because there are a wide variety of things that are called moss that are not at all moss. But mosses are plants. They're land plants. And they diverged in an evolutionary way from the vascular plants about 400 million years ago. Mm-hmm. And along that path that's been unique to the mosses, one group that's pretty special is the peat mosses. It's the genus Sphagnum. And the peat mosses are really special because they can engineer their own ecosystem. They are actively preventing their own decomposition. And so the definition of peat being growth rate exceeds decomposition rate, the sphagnum peat mosses are releasing acids into the water. They also have antibacterial properties that prevent their own decomposition. And so much in the same way that a beaver pond was created by a beaver, a peatland was created by peat moss.
Huh. Hey, that's so fascinating to me because I talk about peat a lot and sphagnum, and we actually just recently talked about it in my class as we were talking about soil amendments and things like that. And I've never heard it put that way, and that's such an interesting thing.
Right. Yeah. So I should say that there are other things that form peat. There's grasses that form peat. That's just sort of the general definition of peat as an ecosystem type,
Mhm.
is that there's more growth than there is decomposition.
Okay.
There are also other peat mosses that generally are found in slightly different peatlands, especially in the northern sort of boreal regions.
Mhm.
These are mosses that are in a different class. So they are as different from sphagnum peat mosses as an oak and a pine,
Interesting.
and probably even more so from a time standpoint, but
Yeah.
different class from a categorization. Yeah.
Huh. So peat has been a common soil amendment or a media amendment. So when we grow in the greenhouse, most of our mixes have some amount of peat.
Right.
And in the industry, there's two camps. Like there are, again, people like to argue. In the industry, in the horticultural science, there's a big group that I probably belong to that thinks we need to completely move away from harvesting peat for this purpose of adding it to soil and things like that. Because these are, at least in my probably crude understanding, very delicate ecosystems that, over time as we cut them and break them down, it takes a long time for them to recover. And there's people that are like, nah, cut the peat, put it in the thing, whatever. Where do you fall? Okay, I keep putting you on the spot. I almost feel bad about this. Almost. Like, is that a real concern? Is that something we should really be kind of backing away from and finding other methods for?
I think it would be good in the same way that other sustainable practices are going to help us prolong the major disasters associated with global warming.
Mm-hmm.
Carbon is a very important aspect of that changing climate. And there is a tremendous amount of carbon locked up in sphagnum peat mosses.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to get the stats wrong on the spot, but
Sure.
It's something like they store an amount of carbon that is equivalent to like 10 years worth of human emissions.
Wow.
And there's a very large amount of biomass, and a lot of it is right now locked up underneath the permafrost.
Mm-hmm.
So they fixed their carbon a long time ago. It got trapped under the permafrost, and then what little bacteria there are not only trapped there with them, they're producing methane. And so then permafrost melts and the methane comes out, and that's what we talked about with like runaway warming in some of the models. That's way outside my expertise.
Sure.
It's just the like peat moss facts just end up is like clearly sphagnum is the most important moss from a global change and from an economic standpoint. And then the worst thing you can probably do with peat moss is then burn it. And there is a large proportion of especially Northern Europe that actually still use peat moss as a fuel source. And then, the guilty pleasure then is to realize that your peaty whiskeys are also being flavored by burning a source of. So I toured some peatland restoration sites in Edmonton. The botany conference, or like national big scientific conference, was near there. It was really interesting. The Canadians are doing an okay job. The companies have self-selected to restore their own peatlands. And it's a really interesting way that they do this. They have, the harvesting of peat involves these gigantic vacuum cleaners on trucks, essentially, that like drive over it and collect the peat, and then it ends up in the bags that you see at the big box stores. That's dead.
Okay.
Ish.
I really like the word dead-ish. It's only mostly dead.
Right. There's a lot of debate sometimes at the border when we bring plants in with a plant collecting permit, and they're like, is this soil or is this plant? And we're like, yes.
Yeah? Question mark?
Because it is possible that it's just usually the top 6 to 10 centimeters of a peatland is living peat moss and other plants that happen to grow on them. And beneath that is probably a region where you could regenerate peat moss into live plants, and that's the ish part. But then below that is the true peat, which is, very, very slowly decomposing biomass.
Sure.
And they need to get that top part off. in order to get to the part that you use for gardening and fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And getting that top part off involved bulldozing the top layer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they usually do that in the winter because it's a little easier to scrape that off and throw it in a giant pile. And the restoration experts say that it is possible to regenerate 5 hectares for every 1 hectare of stuff that they collect.
Huh.
And so that giant pile of like moss and other plant material and snow, they leave it around for a while and then they can spread it onto another field to regenerate it. I visited one of these about 20 years post. It's not seeding because they don't make seeds.
Right. Sure.
Post broken moss material replanting.
Yeah.
And all of the species were there, but it looked weird.
Huh.
So we even found a rare species that, it would be difficult to find in this area. So that, to me, suggests that the restoration was okay from a biodiversity standpoint. But the reason it looked weird is if anybody's ever gone out into a bog, you're walking up and down little tiny hills all the time. They're called hummocks. And different species of sphagnum will actually make the hummocks versus live closer to the water table. This is back to that whole how the heck do different species coexist.
Sure, right.
Different reason why I think sphagnum is fascinating. And that microtopography does not exist after only 20 years because there's no peat accumulation yet. And so is peat a renewable resource? It is plant-based, but it might take like 10,000 years before there's a peatland there again.
Yeah, okay. So technically...
right.
But...
probably closer to coal than it is to like a pine plantation or something.
Yeah.
And the other aspect of that is we were told, so this is Dr. Lynn Rochefort at Laval in Canada that's kind of heads up all of this restoration. She says that there are peatlands in the U.S., not sphagnum peatlands, but other peatlands that have not been restored after being harvested. They still look like the surface of the moon 100 years later. The water table fluctuates up and down, and it's the peat moss that's actually keeping that a little bit more stable. And when you remove that, you have to drain the peatland of all of its water. It's a wetland.
Sure.
That really messes everything up. And so there is no restoration without intentional restoration, probably, and definitely going to take a long time to make it back to that area.
It's really interesting. And we do things sometimes as a species. Now, I mean, and by sometimes I mean almost constantly,
Right.
without really knowing what we're doing. We just do things, and we're like, okay, yeah, this is a great resource for X, Y, and Z. And it's always interesting having to see the remediation side on the back end. And in some ways, you can't fault people for not knowing like what they don't know.
Right.
You don't know, right? But now with the information we have, it's like, okay, we can maybe find other, like coconut core is the husks of coconuts. They shred it up. It has a similar consistency. We're growing coconuts anyway.
Right.
And that's a whole other conversation.
That's something that I'm actually interested in because I do get this question quite often about what should I do about peat. And at least until the last couple of years here in Lubbock, I really couldn't find peat-free soil mixes. You can now. There's a couple of brands out there. But I don't know yet, like, how's that going to deal with the like potted plants that we like to have in our yard? Is it going to be holding moisture the same way that the coconut is going to hold moisture the same way that the peat moss does? So that's the part I don't know about.
It's pretty interesting, and I've seen a couple of studies and just have had some practical experience that it's not exactly the same, but I think it's close enough. And I say that with some hesitation because I'm sure I'll get a message about that. So, no, it doesn't. It's blah blah blah. Coconut's bad. Whatever. There's always another issue. But again, we do what we can, and we make some small incremental changes. I think, and if adding the husk of a coconut to your pot instead of something from a 10,000-year-old peat bog, is a net good, for the environment, then okay. Maybe that's a thing we do. Maybe that's and even if we have to change some of our horticultural practices to adapt to this. Maybe we switch out plant A for a very closely related but tougher plant B, or that fills that same like horticultural niche. Maybe that's a thing we really need to evaluate and really need to think about. It's a complex issue for sure.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, what you said about coconuts, I'm sure that there's some other reason why we may not want to be encouraging the 1-for-1 replacement of peat moss with coconut coir, simply because we don't grow them in North America as much. And so,
So it's a big thing. But, I think that I think an encouraging part of this is that, there are companies, there are groups doing large scale restoration efforts. And
that was the point that was made to me, and yes, we always have to encounter the biases of the people who are talking to you. And so when someone who's a peat company manager is telling me like why it's okay that we're harvesting this non-renewable resource, and they're saying, well, we're only like 0.3% of the way through harvesting all of Canada's peatlands. So they're out there. Yeah. And 2, people are buying it. And so wouldn't you want to buy it from a group that is doing at least something in a sustainable way versus we could just do nothing.
And
it's like, I don't really respond to that like hostage situation, but it's a point.
Stockholm syndrome, but with peat moss.
Right.
That's an interesting take too, because how much of it is marketing and another thing that I think about a lot is, okay, you see whatever trend is popular in the public zeitgeist about, and all the companies jump on board, right?
Right.
And it's really easy to be, for me, I end up being cynical about that a lot. Like, oh, they're just trying to, ride this wave, and maybe they are. But ultimately, if there is net good that comes from it, like, like you said, they could just be like, well, I don't care. I'm not doing anything.
Right. And does in this particular case seem to be, there's like the Canadian peat moss consortium or something of companies that are working with the Canadian government in this case. So that one's a little different than some of these just more voluntary, go with the flow kind of trends.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. I think it's a good place. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back, and I'm going to ask you to, 1, define a moss, because that's something I realize we haven't done yet. Is like, what is a moss? And then 2, we'll talk about the herbarium and sort of the rest of your role and everything else.
Great.
Well, hey there. Welcome to the mid-roll. So glad to see you here again. How are you doing? How's your mom? She doing okay? Feeling better? I'm glad to hear that. Thanks so much to our sponsors, Forest Proud. Forest Proud is a nonprofit organization focused on forest-based climate solutions. They link industry, research, the public, and everyone and anyone in between to talk about how trees make our climate better. Head over to forestproud.org for more information. And if you head to the shop at forestproud.org/shop, use the promo code Planthropology at checkout and grab some cool swag at a discount. Thanks also to the Texas Tech Department of Plant and Soil Science for sponsoring this show and making sure that I can do it every week or every week-ish or whenever I happen to manage to get an episode out. Thanks to you for listening. I think it's cool that you're here. I'm glad you're here right now. Follow and connect with Planthropology all the places. I am on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter as Planthropology. That's anthropology with a PL slapped right there on the front. It's nonsense and it's a good word. Look for the green background with bristlecone pine, and that'll be me. I'm also on TikTok as @theplantprof, and I would love for you to check me out there. And you can find me and all that was left of my dignity. Yep, it's over there on the TikTok machine. Lots of good stuff coming up on Planthropology through the summer. I'll be traveling a little bit and doing a few other things, so you may hear some throwback episodes or some other random stuff that might pop up and will also be very fun. If you would like to support the show through all the traveling and randomness, you can buy some swag at planthropologypod.com/merch. Take you to my Redbubble store, and there's all kinds of cool stuff there. You can head to buymeacoffee.com/planthropology, and for the price of a coffee, you'll buy me a coffee. Those are all great ways to support the show. You can also tell a friend, which would be awesome. If you love the show, post on Twitter about it, or on Instagram or Facebook, or send up smoke signals, whatever you want to do. I don't care. Tell a friend about it. That would be awesome. Also, you can leave me a rating and review on Apple or Podchaser. It takes just like 30 seconds. I wear a size 5-star and kind words, and it really means a lot to me, and it really helps me out. You can also go join the Planthropology's Cool Plant People Facebook group. It is a group with cool plant people who listen to Planthropology. Go check out the Podfix Network. Thanks to Podfix for letting me be a part of it. Go to podfixnetwork.com and you can find all kinds of goodies there. So, yeah, let's talk about moss some more. All right. Well, we are back. And I don't take a lot of notes, but I had in my notes, ask him what moss is. And then I didn't do that. So what's a moss?
Yeah, so a moss is a plant that is without vascular tissue. So no xylem, no phloem, none of these 100-point Scrabble word things that you learn in basic plant stuff. But they are not transporting their water from roots, because they don't have roots, through their stems, because they don't have stems, to their leaves, because they don't have leaves.
Yeah, so they're very simple plants, I guess.
So they do have a lot of simplicity. So the water is getting in. There are rhizoids, which might have some homology, sort of similarity to root hairs in vascular plants, kind of extensions of little cells. Their leaflets are one cell thick. And, when we talk about peat moss, there are actually two different cell types. They'll have cells that hold water only, and there'll be cells that have the green stuff that do photosynthesis. So as land plants, they're doing photosynthesis. They're reproducing via spores, but they are able to do all of this without transporting water, via traditional methods that a vascular plant would do.
So is that, and this is going to be a dumb question, and I apologize in advance. I am not an evolutionary biologist. Is that why they're short?
Yeah, that is why they're short.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're not all short. So there's about a 1 meter, 3 foot tall moss in Australia. And peat mosses can actually be quite long, although, again, back to the whole what is alive and what is dead question. But peat mosses, especially to continue that trend, are really special. They hold so much water, and they actually can wick that water up their central axis. I don't want to say stem to not offend the vascular plant crowd.
Sure.
They don't have a stem, but there's a central axis, and some of their leaves are wrapped around that and kind of wick water up. And then they can store 30 times their weight in water.
Wow.
In their leaves, in their cells. And so then a lot of them are short and small because they can't get out of the off the ground very much, but they're still able to get around along, growing along on plants, or even what are called epiphilic mosses that grow on the leaves of especially broad tropical plants, and so they have a wide variety of habitats that they've adapted to after the presence of flowering plants sort of taking over the world. The mosses responded to that, and so they're, despite being small and simple, I don't want to give you the impression that they're primitive or that they're I kind of hate the term living fossil, because mosses and oak trees share a common ancestor 400 million years ago or more. But the oak tree became a giant tree and has all this complicated physiology and morphology. But the same amount of time has passed to where our modern mosses are. And this is kind of a overall kind of trend in combating sort of popular thinking about evolution with how it's actually happening. That we shouldn't think about plants that are alive today as ancestors. They are today. They're your cousins, not your great grandparents.
That's such an important point, because one thing I have understood, and we or not understood, that's not the word I meant. One thing I've sort of learned and discovered teaching, and we talk very little about evolutionary biology. We mention it early on and talk about the history of plants and a little bit, not nearly as much as I'm sure you go into depth with. And, again, my understanding is poor, I'm a dig a hole and put a plant in it guy. But evolutionary biology is so poorly understood. And I think, like you mentioned, we think that thing A existed and then thing A went away and thing B is here,
Right.
and it's not really it.
No, that's what you think of the very classic illustration of the monkey followed by the slightly standing up primate, followed by the chimpanzee looking thing, followed by the human, followed by the somebody crouching over the desk recording podcasts. But
in front of a microphone.
Right, but that's what we call kind of ladder-like thinking. It's a way of thinking of evolution as this replaces this, and maybe the way that the common phrases make their way out into the public, like survival of the fittest, means that there are winners and there are losers. And there are winners and there are losers within each generation. And yes, sometimes the ultimate loss of a whole group of organisms going extinct. But the ones that survive have the same past as not the same past, but they have a converging past with other organisms that are alive today. And especially when you get into what I study at the genome level, at the genetic level, there's plenty of change. The mosses are accumulating lots and lots of changes that are separate and independent of the ones that developed in a flowering plant over the same time period. Like maybe they didn't generate acorns, and they're not 50 feet tall.
Sure, right.
But they're still processing carbon and turning it into sugar. And that reflects that shared history.
And I guess it's just that the selection pressure in whichever niche in which they exist didn't push them up. It pushed them maybe into more internal changes rather than large scale morphological changes. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things about recent evolutionary biology, and I guess you kind of split up evolutionary biology into different timescales. There's the survival of the fittest, like competition for resources and offspring within a group of organisms.
Yeah.
But then the deeper time questions, one of the really cool patterns that's happened in plants is the rise of the flowering plants, the angiosperms, created niches that didn't exist before. There's a closed canopy. There's new niches in the understory. There's broad-leaved plants that didn't really exist as much when the ferns and other things were the dominant tree-like things. But what we find in at least two of the major groups of bryophytes, that's the mosses and the other groups that need a little bit more PR, because they're called liverwort and hornwort. They get a bad rap because
bad
of
branding.
Bad of the branding. But two of those groups actually expanded their species count after flowering plants, and so did the ferns. And so this is a theory called the shadow of the angiosperms theory. And in the shadow of the angiosperms, there's low light conditions, which actually means that there's different wavelengths of light that are available for the plants in the understory. And that caused genetic and genomic changes that within groups of mosses and ferns and liverworts, certain groups adapted and survived and thrived and expanded their number of species. And so to kind of think about a moss as this primitive organism that hasn't changed since the dawn of land plants is kind of forgetting about that aspect, that lots of things can happen, even if there's not always this progression towards complexity, which is another common misconception of evolution, I think.
That's fascinating. It's so fascinating. I'm going to have you back sometime just to talk about just evolutionary biology, because there's so much to discuss. And it, again, as someone who understands the basics of it, but maybe not some of the intricacies, it is just mind blowing every time I learn more about it.
Right.
But that actually kind of leads us into talking about, one, what a herbarium is, and the purposes of it, because let's take that one at a time. So tell us like what you do as the director of this herbarium. What is a herbarium, and what do y'all try to accomplish?
Yeah, a herbarium is a museum for dried, pressed plant specimens. It's not all pressed, because usually moss specimens are not pressed, but vascular plants like flowering plants, just like between pages of a heavy book like you might do when you're a kid. But we do this between layers of cardboard and newspaper, pressing them really flat, tying them down really tight, and then just letting them dry really preserves them really beautifully in some cases. Decades later, you're still seeing flower corolla color, and you can see all these really interesting details. It's kind of wild that they don't they don't degrade and they don't get super moldy if you do it this way. And so a herbarium can be a record of the botanical diversity, and you can use that to see what plants were in a particular time and a particular place, because somebody collected those plants and made a label that says, hey, I collected this species at this place and this time.
No, that's interesting, and like I think it's interesting, like, to see it in person, because I don't know, like I don't know if I didn't know what I expected,
Sure,
right? But like going up there, it's like really like feels like very secure cabinets full of samples and like folders,
right?
And I don't know what I expected, but like you pulled stuff out and it's like a manila folder with like plants in it,
right? Yeah, so it is. Usually a plant is collected, the primary reason for taxonomy, back to the what is a species thing. So from a taxonomy standpoint, when someone describes a species, they need to identify one of those collections as typical of that species. So that's why it's called a type specimen.
Okay.
Those are pretty special. We try not to have them in our herbarium because our fire suppression could be better. Some of the really fancy herbaria, there are ones that have millions of collections. There's one at the Royal Botanical Garden in Kew, London, where they have a whole building of type specimens, and you have to sign a waiver to get in because they have an argon gas fire suppression system. They care more about the dead plants than they care about humans in the case of fire.
That's funny.
And so you got to get out of there. There's priceless collections that have been made. And so they're a record of this. I think that this is a new species and this is typical of that species. So I'm going to designate this one. And then the rest of the specimens of that species can be used as a record of variability. They can be used as a record of where and when these species occurred. So when we turn that information into digital data, now you can download a map that's like anybody who's ever collected Bouteloua gracilis bluegramma.
Yeah.
And so you can just go online and do that right now. And that's because a lot of agencies have funded the digitization of these collections so that they're not just locked up in these cabinets.
Yeah. Well, and I think that leads to the question sometimes, and with everything being digital, everything's digital, right?
Right.
Like everything's on the internet. Like for you personally, what do you think are the main benefits of still keeping physical, once living samples of things?
Because they still contain information.
Okay.
The closest thing to my research is that they still contain DNA.
Okay.
We've heard, maybe many people have heard about ancient DNA, get DNA out of mastodon bones and Neanderthals and things like this. We don't really call it that because it's not quite ancient. Maybe antique DNA is a term I've used. And so 60 to 100, even 200-year-old herbarium specimens can be sampled, grind up the tissue and extract DNA, and we can understand something about their genetics and how they relate to other individuals of the species without having to go out and collect a new sample. They also contain records of what their physiology was like when they were alive. So stomata, which are the holes in the leaves for gas exchange. You can make an impression of a herbarium specimen, look at how dense their stomata are packed, which is a plant's response to the CO2 and water around it. The effort at photosynthesis it was doing, you can measure that by like getting a chemical analysis of the plant.
Wow.
And so that's just new research stuff, but it also matters for old research and going back.
Hmm.
I was part of a study where we looked at the ecology of a bunch of species of peat moss, of course.
Yeah.
But a lot of those samples were marked as a particular species identification. And someone else came along and did this whole species as a hypothesis. We're actually going to split this into 2 species. But nobody had kept the plants. And so we can't go back and we can't say like, oh, this part of the distribution of the ecology was this new species and the old species had this distribution instead. And so you need that record for when the species hypothesis changes so that you can go back and check.
That's it's so fascinating. And we talk about the ecological and biological history of our planet. Mm-hmm. And it's so important, I think, because nothing exists in a vacuum, right? On this planet, everything has an effect on everything else. We all exert pressure on everything else around us, the environment, different species, all of this. And when we talk about history a lot of times, I think it's hard because in human history, with our recorded history, it's so grainy, for lack of a better term, right? Like history is written by the victors and there's like bias put into it. But when we talk about ecological history, we can literally take these old samples and like science them. Mm-hmm. There's technical, right? Very, very, very fancy technical terms here, and get like empirical data about what the world looked like. And I explained this sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I explained this to my students that like when we talk about, oh, the world was like this 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, etc. We're not just like throwing darts to see what sticks. Like we don't have just like a wheel of words about the past. Like we use empiricism to get at this.
Right. Yeah, no, I think those are really important records that stay around with herbarium specimens. Sometimes better than museum specimens because we're not pickling things in nasty chemicals.
Right.
They're actually really, really good preservations. But I know I wanted to make a point that was related to what you said about humans. And I think a herbarium is also a really great way for we as scientists and especially students to interact with this, this realization science is done by humans.
Uh-huh.
And so we can use the herbarium as a way in. Think about, ask a question. Here's a species, occurs all over the Great Plains, south in Texas. What's the oldest specimen you can find in Lubbock, Texas? And they're like 1910. Mm-hmm. It's like, does that mean that this species was not in Lubbock before 1910? And some of them are like, oh, that must be when it was distributed here. It's like, or it might be that the people that have been living here for 10,000 years or more, that wasn't what they were into. And so they didn't collect plants or work with plants the same way that we do. And so this colonial aspect, as settlers are making their way up to the high plains after the Civil War, that is when we change the landscape. And it's also when we change how we record the landscape. And so the data itself is, by its own nature, has to be collected by humans, and humans are not perfect.
Yeah.
And so not just that there are mistakes, but there are biases and there are value systems that are different among different cultures.
That's such an interesting way to think about it. But you're, absolutely right. Like again, same thing. Nothing exists in a vacuum. We all exert pressure on our record keeping, on everything else. And,
right.
So social evolution's a whole other thing as well, but the concepts maybe are not, that we evolve as society, we evolve and change in different areas in different ways. And I think it's an important thing to look back on too, where it's really easy to look at past specimens and call them primitive.
Sure.
When it's not that, it's just that they were interacting with their environment in a specific way, and the environment changes over time. I think that's really fascinating.
Right.
So as your role, I want to talk a little bit about like actually what you do in the herbarium,
sure.
Right? Because director of the herbarium sounds like a cool title. At least to me as a plant nerd, I think that's a pretty cool title.
Right.
Like, what does that involve? What is your day-to-day like?
I think that the director title is probably because we're not a super big herbarium. 30,000 does sound impressive, not compared to London and Paris and New York and even Missouri Botanical Garden in the U.S. has a million or more
Oh, okay.
specimens. And it's that each of those herbaria then might have taxon specific curators, the curator of ferns, the curator of mosses, the curator of fungi. And we don't really have enough yet to support all of that.
Sure.
And so as director, it's my responsibility to help with the curation activities. And luckily, since I've been here, my department has been very responsive in helping us increase resources for things like undergraduates to do some of the curation, bringing in new specimens. Some people would collect the specimens and they're really nicely pressed and they've got labels on them, but we've got to get them onto the nice acid-free cotton rag paper that's going to last a really long time. And so get to really have a really great experience bringing undergraduates into the herbarium. And they're doing arts and crafts. Yeah. I mean, they're gluing plants to paper, but they're around a thing that is involved in research. And so I view it as a low learning curve way of getting undergraduates involved. And a lot of them have then progressed on to doing research. And then I sometimes process loan requests, which is the old way mostly that people would know that we had anything, is that they'd be like, hey, you got any of this? It's kind of like go fish, but for plants.
for old plants. I like that.
And so we've got a lot of those still processing. And then the major thing that's going on is this digitizing that I mentioned. We're 3 parts to digitizing, taking a picture, high-res image that lives online, along with the transcribed label information. And then that label information can go along and talking about making maps of species distributions. Nobody's got GPS before 2003. And so people use dead reckoning, or the kind of like you go down to the local shop and you turn left and go to 0.3 miles down the road. That's what's on the label.
Right.
But we actually have a fair number of map nerd undergrads. I was one of them at one time. That will be like, I can turn that into a GPS coordinate, plop it down on a map. And then we've got a lot of great information about that. And so that has been the curation and director side, and then also involved with outreach and in-reach, being on the 7th floor of a building whose elevators only go up to 6.
I did notice that when I came to visit. Yeah.
Right. And so getting people in there, knowing what the resource is, how it can be used for getting people into research and then actually as a plant resource, and connecting to the community. So we were at this fun event a couple of weeks ago in town called Ranch Day, where we had kids making herbarium specimens, out of plants that we had pressed ahead of time. So that's cool. Kind of all of those research, teaching, and service as the 3 main wings that you hear about as a faculty member.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And you teach quite a bit. I mean, you've got a lot of students, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I teach the non-majors class that I mentioned, and then a couple of other classes, but usually only about 1 per semester, which is good. But yeah, I had a first class that was taught in the herbarium as a field botany and natural history collections class in the fall last semester. Cool. And that was full with a wait list, and so I'm very excited about the future of the herbarium being something that gets students interested in plants, which can be a struggle, but once they're in there and they're like, wow, this is cool, or they get interested in the history, like who was this person going around collecting plants 50, 70 years ago, and using these collections.
Yeah, really interesting. And something I think we talked about when you gave me a tour up there was that challenge you mentioned of getting students who are non-majors who don't know that they care yet. They've not been convinced that they care yet, that they should care about plants and the environment. And, it touches on some of these bigger issues of how do we make climate change and ecological management and something that people give a crap about, for lack of a better way to put it.
Right.
And I guess just doing our little educational part and talking about the history of our natural history is one link in that chain.
Yeah. I mean, kind of bring it all the way down to what I asked kids at the Ranch Day event. is, this is an event where they've got the meat science department talking about different cuts of meat and, branding cows and, what life was like on a ranch, 100 to 200 years ago. And then, so they're doing all that, and the adorable tiny cowboy hat overload. But then a kid comes up and he's looking at a herbarium specimen from before his grandparents were born.
Yeah.
And I asked the kid, like, why does a rancher need to know about plants? And it takes him a while. And I was like, well, what do we normally have on a ranch? And they're immediately like, cows.
Yeah.
Well, what do cows eat? Like, grass? And I point at, like, here, that is a grass specimen from 1967.
Yeah.
And that is a grass. So a rancher needs to know what that grass is. And so this idea that we can be plant unaware is kind of not a great position for people to be in for true global health ideas. And I do see this among the undergraduates, that once they get into it a little bit, they're realizing that, like, yes, this is important, and this is what I am motivated to do. I think Gen Z gets a lot of crap sometimes, but one thing that they shouldn't get crap for is their caring about the environment, which is only increased since our generation and earlier.
I agree for sure. There's some weird TikTok trends out there, but at the same time, no, I totally agree. Like, I see in my own students, and it's not everyone, and it's not ever going to be everyone, but like a real passion to learn about even just little bits of this. Like, if there's one or two things they can sort of like latch onto that, I care about this. This is cool. I can, grow my own whatever, or I can, I don't know. It's that kind of, how do I say this? That kind of getting to see that little bit of discovery and that epiphany that, this stuff matters, is one of the things that keeps me coming back to keep doing this.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
It's nice that they pay me, but I also I like to getting to experience that.
Yep. And you see that in discovery from students for the first time, and that they can learn something about the world they didn't know before. My non-majors class, yes, we have learning objectives in the true way that you're supposed to set up curriculum, and that's great. My personal objectives in the non-majors botany classes is I want you to care about plants.
Yeah.
And I want you to know what the scientific method really does.
Yeah.
And not how it's taught in high school. And so if we put those two things together into, learning about the scientific method, learning about evolution, learning about, like you said before, we're not just throwing darts. We actually did empirical stuff to figure this out. And here was how we did that, and give students the tools to think about that in their everything else that they're doing. And maybe they go back to their range science major, and they never look at a plant again, but they've at least, leveled up in scientific understanding.
Sure.
That's another really important goal for me.
For sure. And it's really important from a global and societal standpoint too, for sure. Wow. Okay. So before, I just looked at the time, and it's gone quick. Before we kind of start wrapping up, is there anything we missed? Was there anything else you wanted to make sure we got in here today?
We can do a quick lightning round of things that are not moss.
Oh, yes. That sounds great.
Ranger moss, not a moss.
Okay.
It's a lichen. It's actually maybe even cooler than moss in some ways, because it's a symbiosis between a fungi and an algae that kind of looks superficially like moss.
Huh.
There's a group of marine organisms called bryozoans. Those are moss animals, is how that actually breaks down. So they're not moss either. Spanish moss is, of course, my favorite, because it is neither Spanish nor moss.
Plants do need much better PR, don't they?
Yeah, you can find the Spanish moss in the family with bromeliads, pineapples.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of things like that where, superficially you've got this simple looking structure, but it could mislead. And so, and then a lot of times you'll see, I've got moss on my roof. How can I get rid of it? Well, that's probably algae. And unless you're in the Pacific Northwest. So, so that's something I always like to cover, is what isn't moss.
Yeah, no, that's really, and I wish we had time to really get into lichen because lichens are so weird.
Lichens are awesome. We probably should have somebody else on for that. 'Cause they're definite experts on that would tell you all kinds of great things.
I need to track down a lichen scientist, lichenologist.
Lichenologist.
Yeah.
It's funny that one of the societies I belong to is American Bryological and Lichenological Society, which is a weird pairing now that we know that fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. But from a traditional standpoint of just like small plants and plant-like things that don't move
and grow on rocks,
right? You put them together, but the lichenologists have a lot of very interesting things. If you get a lichenologist on here, if they're really a lichenologist, they'll have a little bottle of potassium hydroxide with them at all times. Because that's
is that their tell?
That actually, yes, it is. It's actually something that they use to distinguish species of lichens. So
that's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, I need to take some notes on find a lichenologist.
Absolutely.
So cool. Okay. I don't even know where to start looking for one of those, but I'll figure it out. Twitter's an amazing thing. I could probably just ask for one. Okay, Matt, that was really awesome. That was really, my brain's kind of buzzing if you can't tell. There's so many other questions I want to ask you, but we'll maybe save that for another time. The question I always ask all my guests at the end is if you could send something home with our listeners, piece of advice could be academic life advice, something moss related, whatever you want. What would that thing be?
I was thinking about this because, I listened to a bunch of your episodes on a recent road trip and wrote that down like he's going to ask.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I would say stay curious. I think a lot of people will tell scientists you have to be skeptical. Skeptical is good. Skeptical helps us not accept the easy answer to what our data is telling us. That's great. Skepticism can sometimes lead to cynicism, which can go down to a dark place sometimes. But there's something special about being curious. You have to admit that you don't know something. And that's humbling and scary, but it's okay. I want to communicate that. It's okay to be curious. And when I learn something that I didn't know before, that's like one of the best human experiences.
Yeah.
And so stay curious.
It's awesome. It's awesome. Wow, man, like I said, an hour goes quick. But where can we find you? Do you want to be found on the internet?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I'm not on quite as many social media platforms as you are.
Well, because you're smarter than me. That's why.
And I don't understand some of them as well as another reason. But on Twitter at Moss Matters, which is a triple pun on either being matters pertaining to mosses or that moss matters, or also that my name is Matt. My wife came up with
one. That's really clever.
My wife came up with that, and so she's very proud.
She should be. That's awesome.
It's amazing. So at Moss Matters, and mossmatters.com is my professional website as well.
Okay, so. Very cool. Well, man, I appreciate you coming out here to the greenhouse and talking with me and all that. And it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
And to all of you listening, I hope you have a deeper appreciation for moss and the things that are not moss. And I hope that you stay curious too and that you keep being cool to each other. So take care. We'll talk to you next week. And I hope you'll have a great day. Y'all, I don't know if you realize this, but so many of my guests have suggested that we all stay curious as their advice at the end of the episode. And I think that's really meaningful. And I think we should really take something away from that. And I really loved Matt's advice about guarding ourselves against cynicism and how while we should be skeptical to a certain extent, gosh, this sense of wonder is such an amazing thing. Thanks so much, Matt, for coming on and being a part of this. You were a pleasure to talk to. I hope we can do this again. Thanks most of all to you, the listener, for being a part of this as well. You know that I do this for you, and it means the absolute world to me that you listen and that you follow along and you interact on social media and all of that. Thanks to our sponsors again, Forest Proud and the Texas Tech Department of Plant and Soil Science. The show was recorded, produced, edited, all the things by yours truly. Thanks for listening. We've got more great plant stuff coming up, more botanists on the way, and a couple of other really fun guests that I don't want to ruin the surprise about. So thanks for listening. Y'all keep being really cool plant people. Keep being kind to one another. And if you have not been kind to one another so far, hey, maybe give that a try. I love you. Take care, and we'll talk soon.